Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Collapse, The Fall of the Soviet Union, by Vladislav Zubok, narrated by David Vries. Introduction. A Puzzle. They finally got rid of him, that windbag. I heard this comment from fellow passengers on board an Aeroflot flight from Moscow to New York, which had just made a stop at Shannon, Ireland. It was the morning of 19 August, 1991, and it took me a few minutes to realize that these people were alluding to the removal of Mikhail Gorbachev from power. They had learned the news from CNN during the refueling stop, and they clearly approved of what they heard. The plane was full of Russians. Some of them were flying to conferences and diplomatic assignments. Most were going on private business, to see émigré relatives, and for other reasons. I was flying to the United States with several projects in mind. A few months earlier, I had begun working as a Russian aide for the journalist Strobe Talbot and historian Michael Beschloss, who were writing a book about the end of the Cold War. In my bag, I was carrying tapes recording my interviews with Soviet officials. I had also decided to write my own book about the Soviet experience of the Cold War. The prestigious Amherst College in Massachusetts had offered me a fellowship to start my project, far from the turmoil of Moscow where I was born and had lived all my life up to that point. The news about Gorbachev's arrest was completely unexpected. As a young Moscow-based academic intellectual, I had been rooting for his reforms and liberalization in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev had evoked big expectations, yet since 1990, together with my friends, I had switched my allegiance to Boris Yeltsin, who sought a radical break with the old order. Nobody among the people I knew had any doubt that the old system, the Communist Party, centralized economic management, and the socialist choice, were doomed. Still, no one wanted to storm the Kremlin and tear down the structures of the state. Everyone hoped for reform, not revolution. With my friends, I took part in democratic rallies, avidly read the work of economists who discussed how to return from a command economy to a market economy, and supported independence movements in Lithuania and Georgia. After my plane arrived at New York's JFK Airport, I bought a hefty copy of the New York Times. The newspaper informed me that Mikhail Gorbachev had apparently been ousted from power by the military and the KGB while on vacation in distant Crimea. During the fall of 1991, I worked in the library and archives of Amherst College, but spent more time reading and watching the news from home. The immense relief when the coup failed and Gorbachev returned to the Kremlin quickly gave way to anxiety about the future. The Soviet economy was in freefall. Ukraine and other republics intended to leave the Union. My mind was exploding in cognitive dissonance. I found myself a citizen of a state that was collapsing, and I could not share the excitement of American colleagues who joked that the USSR was now the union of fewer and fewer republics. Fortunately, my wife and son were staying with me in Amherst. Life went on, and at the end of September, my second son was born in a hospital in Northampton, Massachusetts. Yet a gnawing thought persisted. What sort of country would we be returning to? We never got back to the USSR. On a return flight, my plane landed at Sheremetyevo, Moscow, on 31 December 1991, but by that time the leaders of the Russian Federation, Ukraine, Belarus, and other republics had dissolved the Soviet Union. Gorbachev had resigned. The dimly lit Sheremetyevo airport was empty. Nobody to refuel the plane, nobody to operate a jet bridge, no customs officers, nobody even to check the passports and visas of arriving passengers. The new Russian state was the country of unprotected borders, without customs, with devalued currency and empty stores. The immutable state structure seemed to have evaporated. The country that I had left just a few months ago in August had suddenly vanished. For many years I wanted to write about the end of the Soviet Union, yet I believed more time should pass before more dispassionate attitudes to this epic event could be formed. I waited in vain. As memories of 1991 faded, opinions and myths acquired a life of their own. What was a provisional insight became an established view, immutable, just like the Soviet statehood had been before 1991. In the West, the Soviet collapse came to be universally accepted as predetermined and inevitable, something too self-evident to require further study. When in 2005, Russian President Vladimir Putin called the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, most Western observers ridiculed him for his reactionary nostalgia. It was the time of Western liberal triumphalism and the enlargement of NATO to the east. This mood changed after Russia's war with Georgia in 2008 and the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Western commentators began saying that Russia wanted to restore its lost empire. In 2019, the Polish head of the European Council, Donald Tusk, said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a blessing for Central and Eastern Europe, for Georgians, Poles, and Ukrainians. Only a few in the West recalled that the Russian Federation had been a leading actor in the Soviet dissolution. Mikhail Gorbachev remained the lonely hero in the West, since everyone acknowledged that he had set inevitable historical developments in motion. When Gorbachev supported Russia's annexation of Crimea, it was dismissed as an atypical pronouncement. In Russia, reactions to the Soviet collapse remain polarized. Liberal-minded people believe that the Soviet Union could not be reformed, and that even to write about its autopsy was a waste of time. Good riddance to the empire that could not give its people even bread and entertainment. Others feel nostalgia for Soviet greatness and think that Stalin was a great leader, while Gorbachev had sold out to the West. Some of them were not even born when the Soviet Union collapsed. Scholars who studied the end of the Soviet Union identified several causes of the state's demise. Their conclusions can be summarized as follows. First, the superiority of the United States and its policies in the Cold War had made the USSR retreat and surrender. Second, Gorbachev's glasnost had discredited both communist ideology and doomed the Soviet system to failure. Third, the Soviet Union had died because its economy imploded. Fourth, the movements for national independence had led to the implosion of the last empire. Finally, the most powerful Soviet elites had opposed Gorbachev's reforms, and thereby inadvertently caused the demise of the USSR. In this book, I argue that none of those causes, when taken separately, could have destroyed the Soviet Union, and it took me some time to understand how all those threads had converged in a kind of perfect storm unleashed by the rule of Mikhail Gorbachev. The literature about external Cold War pressures argues that the Soviet Union collapsed because it was overstretched. It lost the war in Afghanistan, carried the unbearable burden of military expenditures, and subsidized its clients around the world. The Soviet superpower, some scholars contend, could no longer compete militarily and technologically with the United States and its Western allies. Yet recently, scholars have concluded that U.S. pressures had little to do with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. And, at least since 1987, Western governments were surprised and dismayed by the Soviet Union's destabilization and then disintegration. Recently, more nuanced studies of the Western, especially American, factor in the Soviet collapse have appeared. This book explores the external factors as secondary to the internal causes. International factors became crucial for shaping the behavior of the Soviet elites and counter-elites, but only after the Soviet Union had entered its terminal crisis. Glasnost, Gorbachev's policy of openness and transparency, and the media's attack on the communist past and ideology greatly contributed to the rise of anti-communist and nationalist movements. Yet it is not entirely clear what role ideological breakdown played in the disintegration of the Soviet statehood. For the Soviet elites, especially in Moscow, Stalin's crimes and repressions had long been known. and the majority of those in the party ranks, especially younger cohorts, had long been imitating socialist rhetoric.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?